Live now, I think.
Good morning. This is Wednesday, January 27th, 2021, Senate Judiciary Committee meeting. Our first item on the agenda today is S30, an act relating to prohibited possession of firearms in childcare facilities, hospitals, and certain buildings. We have a number of witnesses scheduled, and I hope we can continue somewhat of a focus on what are some of the other laws that impact people carrying in places where there's signs that clearly say you're not supposed to carry firearms. So with that, we'll continue with Chris Bradley, who we left off with last week on this subject. Chris represents the Vermont Federation of Sportsmen's Clubs. Chris, welcome again.
Thank you very much, Senator Sears. My name is Chris Bradley. I'm the president and executive director of the Vermont Federation of Sportsmen's Clubs. We represent approximately 60 clubs across the state of Vermont with approximately 11,000 members, not counting their families. To review, I think I started off my testimony last week detailing some of the statutes already on the books having to do with a large number of the concerns that were expressed in Wednesday's testimony having to do with threatening or untoward behavior. Interestingly, I didn't hear from any of those individuals that specifically indicated that firearms in any location was a problem. It seemed to me that there was more threatening involved, both verbally as well as on social media and the like. So I guess to review, I believe I listed something like 8 statutes previously. I'd like to add another 2 to that. I believe there's 10 that in some way address that. However, and all of those, or most of those, have some consideration for intent or knowing. So there has to be some intent or knowing involved. I believe I also relayed the fact that Vermont is one of the second safest state in the nation, and that what we're trying to do apparently is to make Vermont even safer. So I guess we have a slew of laws already on the books, but what I understand with S30 is that we now apparently need a law to address the act of carrying a firearm in, let's call it, an unusual location. I'd like to start by suggesting that the group I represent is incredibly cognizant of the firearms that they own and how those firearms may be interpreted while being carried by others. I believe the vast majority of the people I represent would never consider walking in to one of these facilities openly carrying at all. I certainly wouldn't. And I guess, while we're talking about large government operations, I've served on the Northfield Select Board, and as a selectman, you get put into situations where you have to enforce zoning, where certain people in town may have property taken away. I have been in a situation numerous times where I felt threatened and was threatened. And fortunately, Vermont allows me to take precautions against that. I myself, in considering S30, we don't believe that there's really any evidence that such a bill is needed. Furthermore, I think we heard in testimony on Wednesday that there wasn't any evidence that such prohibitions even exist. I guess I would like to understand the intent of S30 is to provide a mechanism that would allow a firearm to be removed from a location where it was not desired to be. And at the end of the testimony, I raised VSA 13 VSA 3705, and I have now supplied a document to you of pictures that I took around central Vermont of locations that have various signs. I started with Maple Woods with the no shirts signage. I then went to the Pavilion. That seems to have a sign present. Obviously, the State House has a sign present. And then I went to Central Vermont Hospital. And within 5 feet of each other, there are 2 signs, as you can see in the document, that say no firearms and even more expansively, no weapons. I submit to you today that the force of law behind every one of those signs is 3705. Senator Sears, with your permission, I ended by asking Eric Fitzpatrick a question concerning 3705, and I was wondering if he could speak to clarifying my question.
It would be highly unusual for me to ask, but I do want to, once you're finished with your testimony, I would like to ask Eric questions about what kind of current laws are available. So I would rather do it that way.
Oh,
The same way, but rather than having a witness ask ledge counsel a question, I think it's more appropriate. But that's one of my major questions is
thank you,
what
sir.
else is available to try to prevent people where it's signed? And it could be the Price Chopper down in my neighborhood too, that puts up a sign and says you're not allowed to carry weapons in the store.
I thank you for your guidance, Senator, and I'll continue. I guess the statement was repeatedly made in testimony on Wednesday, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there is no law on the books today that would address having a firearm in a location where it was not wanted. And I have to suggest, and we'll seek clarification later, I believe that there is a law. I believe it's in use today. And in fact, it's far more expansive than what's being called for in S30. I believe the criteria that was sought for was we wanted a criminal violation. Couldn't be civil, it had to be criminal. 3705 is a criminal violation, and it provides the same. I'm a computer systems guy. When I look at developing a process, I go through a flow chart to say how does a process work. And when I flow chart how S30 would work in terms of enforcement, it's an identical flow chart to the same enforcement that would be behind 3705. So I guess I need to just clarify the statement that if there is a law in the books today that addresses having a firearm in a prohibited location, and it can be dealt with today. So as far as dropping down into the weeds, as far as parking lots and other weapons and knowing and intent, I have to ask, why do we need a completely redundant bill that the only difference between 3705 and what is proposed in S30 is its penalty phase? I believe 3705 calls for 3 months and or $500 fine. I believe it hasn't been changed since 2013, and it may be appropriate to up the penalties related to that statute as a suggestion. I had really hoped to approach this, my testimony today, as a discussion to discuss with this deliberative body the need for a completely redundant bill. When we already have the capability, in fact, more expansive capability. According to 3705, it's a property rights issue. Someone can make the statement that they don't want a firearm on their property, or a business can do that. And in fact, that there's a consumer aspect to this, that if you have such a sign up, people can make informed decisions as to whether they want to go to that location or not. It becomes a property rights issue, and under that umbrella, I virtually have nothing to say. Under a gun bill that clearly is intended to be expansive and to be expanded, when we already have this coverage, I'm really having a difficult time understanding this. I guess I don't want to continue belaboring this point. I'm more than happy to drop into the weeds, if you will, on all the issues that we see with this bill. I just don't see why we need to go to this effort.
But by the same token, wouldn't we did pass laws regarding schools.
Yes, sir.
We did pass laws regarding courts.
Yes, sir.
So somebody found that necessary. And I was here when we did both the schools and I may not have been here when we did the courts. I can't remember, but I know I was here during the schools. I remember dealing with your group and other groups at the time who were concerned about parking lots, things like that. The same questions that come up here. But
Senator,
we evidently decided we needed those laws then.
if I could,
I see this as an extension. I understand your argument.
I don't mean to interrupt, Senator.
Yeah.
With schools, with airports, with courts, a significant investment has been made to provide equipment and personnel to enforce that. Have any of us tried to go to a school recently and actually gain access? It has become exceedingly difficult. Courts, I can enter a court without concern because I'm being screened by equipment. I know there's a uniformed law enforcement there to enforce that nobody should be acting in an untoward fashion. And the same is true with airports. The fact is that you can see a firearm in an airport. I've flown by checking a firearm in an airport. The real concern here, Senator, is that it's either we're going to get serious and protect our people by taking the steps necessary to ensure that protection. And in fact, I can even point at one state that basically says if you do disarm an individual that has a right to self-defense, that the location takes on the responsibility for their safety. So I look at this and say, yes, schools were an issue. I have to say, however, that I think we've seen that schools have become targets. Columbine, Parkland, possibly Fairhaven. These are situations where a piece of paper has been put up to say you can't do this. And we heard in testimony that those prohibitions don't work. There's no evidence they work. Yet here we have 3705 that clearly shows if someone is in a place where they shouldn't, let's be candid, in order for any of these things to work, law enforcement has to be present, correct?
Yep.
So if law enforcement has to be present, either they're there already because we've invested that money to have them there, or someone is going to have to make a call to have them come.
Well, I answered that incorrectly. Law enforcement doesn't have to be present at a school. Law enforcement doesn't have to be present at a courtroom. In Bennington, law enforcement is there when you go through the metal detector.
Yes.
But, excuse me.
You're muted.
Oops.
I'm asking Senator Baruth to take over for a minute. Thank you.
Absolutely. Please go ahead, Chris.
I guess we were in discussion concerning the presence of law enforcement actually enforce some of these things. With schools, you can't enter a school these days and just walk in. They're very protected structures. You have to sign in. You have to go through a vestibule. You get your picture taken. It's quite a secure environment. Most office buildings are not that way. And again, I don't want to get down in the weeds because some of the issues concerning buildings and essential government functions, for example, Northfield has its food shelf located in the fire department, the municipal town garage. we have a clothing shelf in another municipal building. We have grave concerns over exactly when a building is and isn't providing an essential government service. So again, we come back to the fact that if your intent, Senator, is to have a law in the books that will allow for the removal of a firearm from a location where it's not desired, and frankly, I think I've demonstrated, even at Central Vermont Hospital today, some rule of law is behind those signs. And I further think that those hospitals have some security presence, if I'm not mistaken. So again, I maintain that in order for these to have some effect, you have to have law enforcement present. And that law enforcement, it can be present via 3705 as easily as it could under how S30 would work.
And I think the chair, before he got off, was responding in one way, and I know Eric Fitzpatrick will respond. The chair wants him to respond a little later.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have other points you'd like to make?
At this point, I have, as previously stated, I do have a list of concerns that I will be providing for the testimony, but frankly, for the sake of brevity and realizing that I was only going to have about 20 minutes of your precious time, I felt I should take the high road and ask the really pertinent questions about why S30 in relation to 3705. And at that, I will end my testimony.
Okay. And
Are there any questions?
I'll ask that in a second. I think it's a fair enough set of questions you pose. If in fact there are other laws that do what S30 purports to do, then I would say that's a strong argument for not passing it. So we'll hear, as I said, from Eric Fitzpatrick. Questions for Chris Bradley? Senator Benning.
Chris, I'm kind of curious. 3705, I think there's going to be some pushback on your contention because nobody's ever tried it before that I'm aware of. But let me just think about this a second. Are you saying that if 3705 had teeth given to it, which would clearly make it a notice against trespass, if in fact somebody had a sign up out front that said no guns, does that satisfy your concern? Let me try to rephrase it because I'm only thinking about this for the first time. Your argument is that 3705 is a way of saying you've already got a law in the books. That's never been tested in the courts that I'm aware of. I understand where you're going with it logically. But if the legislature was to say officially with an amendment to 3705 that violation of any sign that said no weapons allowed would automatically constitute a notice against trespass and therefore would be subjecting the individual who violates it to a liability of some kind. Is that something that you would be comfortable with?
Generally speaking, yes, Senator. I guess I come back to look at Central Vermont Hospital. Look at the signs. Those two signs are in 5 feet of each other at every main entrance to Central Vermont Hospital today. And after making a couple of calls, I believe that most, I can't claim all because I didn't make all those calls, but all major hospitals in Vermont have these signs. What is the rule of law behind those signs?
Normally, I would be looking at this from the perspective of it's a constitutional right. I have the ability to defend myself. An impingement upon that has to be justified. What I heard from some prior witnesses left me very uncomfortable when they said somebody in a given setting should have the right to feel comfortable. To me, that's no excuse for impinging upon a constitutional right. But it seems to me there may be some middle ground to think about here if you're saying that 3705 should be the vehicle to enable a given entity to say no weapons are allowed here. if we change 3705 to make it very clear that there is a sign out front, if it says no weapons and you go in, you are now violating a notice against trespass. And then put whatever penalty attached to it is desired. I'm only thinking this through in my head for the first time.
Yeah.
And I don't know where to go with it other than to ask if you're comfortable with that.
I'm pleased that that seed has been planted, Senator. I guess as I came back to it, it still would require some law enforcement presence to address this person. And I think that's the difference between, say, your usual use of 3705, which is someone goes into a store without a shirt. The proprietor can then go say, excuse me, sir, you're supposed to have a shirt on. And if you don't put a shirt on, I'm going to ask you to leave. That's the typical scenario of a 3705 use, I believe. If the person doesn't leave, law enforcement is called, law enforcement can go address that person and handle it. So I guess I'm seeing the identity. And frankly, sir, I don't want to get into the one, boy, there's open carry, Senator, and there's concealed carry. The two are distinctly different. And I am not going to suggest that a constitutional challenge about concealed carry couldn't be raised concerning this. But we have certainly tread upon constitutional issues before and opted to let the courts decide.
I just want to let you know, I've been in criminal law now for 37 years. I have never heard of anybody being prosecuted for not wearing a shirt at the local market and were told that they couldn't come in for whatever reason.
I'm not sure, prosecution or removal, sir. I believe you will find any number of situations where people are removed.
I'm gonna jump. I think it's clear to me that the folks that you represent, Chris, feel that this is an infringement on their constitutional rights, this proposed bill. And I guess my question falls back, as I was starting to ask, is why is it any different in a school? And your response was it's more difficult to get into schools today, that's for sure. But I'm concerned about hospitals. I really am. That's my basic place. We have, I think it's similar to schools. In hospitals usually have security. I don't know of any that have metal detectors or anything like that, but there are clearly signs regarding weapons. There's also signs regarding tobacco. And we've had cases in other states where doctors have been injured. We've had in this state hospitals where guns have been pulled on doctors to try to get opiates prescribed to them or given to them. So I think it's a growing concern, and the more we ask hospitals to handle, particularly emergency rooms, to handle everything from a potential heart attack to a psychiatric episode, all the more dangerous for staff and workers there. So I'm particularly trying to understand opposition on the hospitals. I can understand concerns about certain government buildings. Could you respond to that? And then Senator White has a comment or question.
My response is simple, Senator. We can either have a piece of paper that says something, or we can actually take the investment needed to enforce what we need, what we're looking to do. Creating a piece of paper that says you can't go in here and do this or else is significantly different than investing in protecting, say, our state employees and their lives by actually buying the equipment and the personnel necessary to protect that. And I guess, Senators, I'm going to come back to a point I may have not touched upon before. And that is the fact that it's my understanding that there are legislators that are armed today and that they go about their business at the State House armed. Whether we want to acknowledge that or not, The fact of the matter is, I'm not sure, and I guess I'd be curious, do any of you have a problem with any of your fellow legislators having the means to defend themselves and possibly you in the event of something bad?
I think I would ask the question in the opposite manner.
Okay.
In the heat of an argument, do I have a problem with a particular legislator having the ability to act on that with a firearm or other weapon, any weapon?
Well, I think
I'd be, I think, you know, I've heard stories over the years. I'm not going to repeat those stories, but in heated arguments where two people across the table in a committee room in the House were both armed years ago. Yeah, I'd be, I don't know about, you know, this whole argument. I'm not going to get into this argument today, Chris. I don't want to, it's, I got to tell you, I'm going to continue to listen to the testimony, but I'm not going to get into an argument that's
I'm not looking
basically, well, you may or may not be. I've told you my feelings about this. I'm particularly concerned about hospitals and the volatility within those hospitals. Do I think legislators should be armed in the Capitol? No. Not when we have a police force that we're spending good money on. We're going to hear from the Capitol Police Chief shortly. So no, and I can't think of anything more tragic than a legislator getting up, you know, feeling threatened or something and pulling a gun on a witness like yourself, who we told you can't be armed.
I guess, Senator, you hit a key point. It must be nice to have guards.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Well, the rest of us don't. And those guards
okay,
are not.
Chris,
Sorry, I don't.
I have too much respect for you to get into this pissing.
Yeah, don't.
Oh, good.
Thank you.
No,
we are. We're getting into this
apologize.
pissing contest, and I'm not interested in that today.
I apologize, sir.
With all due respect, Chris, you know, that's what we're setting on. So
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Senator White.
No, I think I'll leave my comments to our committee discussion, because I'm having some I realize I'm a co-sponsor on this bill, but I'm having very serious concerns about the criminal aspect of it. And I guess what I was going to say was that we did make it a criminal offense to have a gun at schools and in the courthouse. And maybe it shouldn't have been a criminal offense then. I don't know. But I'm beginning to have serious concerns about creating criminal records for people. So so I will just leave because I don't really have a question. I will have some questions for Eric.
I don't see Senator Sears, Senator Baruth. At this point, I have nothing further to say.
Thanks, Chris. Eric Davis. Senator Sears, oops, he's not.
He is back.
Senator Sears, I called Eric Davis, if that's all right.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Davis.
Sorry, I had Marley problems.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Good morning, Senators. My name is Eric Davis. I am the president of Gun Owners of Vermont. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit advocacy group dedicated to the preservation of the right to keep and bear arms. I would like to thank the committee for letting me speak on this bill today. I have never been in front of Senate Judiciary before, so I'm a little bit nervous, and I apologize in advance if I stumble over my words a little bit. Try to bear with me here. I kind of see.
Welcome, Eric, and I'm Dick Sears, the chair, since you've never been before us before. Senator Baruth is the vice chair. Senator Nitke is our clerk. Senator Benning and Senator White are long-term members of the committee. And welcome to Senate Judiciary. It's nice to have you here.
Excellent, thank you, sir.
And please don't be nervous. We all mess up.
I'll do better once I get going here. So I kind of see my job as trying to represent the view of our membership and kind of how we see this, sort of legislation and give our perspective on it. And, whenever we're looking at gun legislation, obviously we're going to look at it, through the lens of how it relates to the right to keep and bear arms under Article 16 of the Second Amendment. But in addition to the issue of constitutionality, we also try to analyze things from a position of, practicality and pragmatism. And that's sort of what I want to focus on today. When we take a look at anything like this, we generally kind of like to apply a sort of cost benefit ratio style of analysis to, to these proposed restrictions, where we weigh the cost of the restrictions on our right to keep and bear arms against the potential benefit of this law to ourselves and our communities. This leads us to ask several questions. The first and most obvious question is what are the potential benefits of this law, or more directly, will this proposed law keep people safe? And I think we've already been into this a little bit, and Senator Baruth has stated that the intent of this bill is not so much to prevent the gun from being brought into these locations as it is to provide a mechanism or a vehicle for the property owners to have it removed from the premises, if you will. Yes,
If I could just interject there, since you're characterizing my views, I would regard the bill as having two major functions. One is keeping the guns out of a building, and another is allowing someone to be removed if they enter the building with a gun. So I think I might have at some time have indicated that one in a certain situation was what I was concerned with, but the bill has both at heart.
Certainly. Okay. I apologize if I misunderstood.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, sure. So, on that note, so there's, the two goals of preventing the firearm and then providing a mechanism to, remove the gun and, assess a criminal punishment to the person that brought it in there. So, that leads us to, a few more questions. And, we like to stop and consider what exactly sort of folks it is that might bring a gun into these places in question. And the way we see it, there are two different types of people who would carry a firearm in these places. And the first type of person that we'll refer to as the type A person, just for the purposes of our analysis here, is the person who carries a firearm, most often concealed, for their own protection. This person takes the security of themselves and their family very seriously. And this is the kind of person that wouldn't threaten anyone with their gun. You would probably not even know this person had a gun, but they are ready to defend themselves if necessary. The second type of person, or the type B person in this analysis, is the person who carries a weapon for nefarious purposes and with malicious intent. This person is the aggressor and the one who would be intent on doing harm. If we've already determined that the law will be largely ineffective in deterring the type B person, those who carry a weapon aggressively and with the intent of doing harm, we have to assume that any direct benefit to come from this bill has to be achieved by how it affects the type A person, or the person that carries lawfully for self-defense. If we look at a little closer at our type A person who carries for self-defense, we see there's all different subgroups of people who carry a gun. The people who carry for protection, they're all around you. They're your neighbors, they're your friends, they're your coworkers, they're store clerks, volunteer first responders, lawyers, tradespeople, business people, all sorts of different folks. They're young parents, they're single mothers. Some of them are older retirees and disabled veterans. And there are a lot of these folks out there. To put this in context, I like to look at a few different numbers that helps quantify just how many folks there are out there who might carry a gun for personal protection. Reports vary. However, the estimates of the total number of firearms in the United States is currently between 350 and 400 million, depending on which study you use. The FBI conducted a total of 39.6 million background checks through the NCIS database in 2020 alone. Almost 40 million background checks just in 2020. Now, there's no official numbers to track how many of these were first-time gun buyers. However, several surveys and publications that we've dug up estimate the number of new gun owners in 2020 to be somewhere between 10 and 20 million, and approximately half of those new gun owners to be women. We think this is relevant because this gives a very strong indicator that people very much value their right to obtain a firearm for their own personal protection. The type A people who acquire a gun and carry a gun, they take their safety very seriously. They're their own first line of defense against the type B aggressor. Many type A people have military, law enforcement, and first responder backgrounds. These skills, we believe, make them an asset to their communities, especially in a scenario where police or private security cannot immediately respond to the threat. Most type A people are honest and don't want to become criminals, and there's a good chance that they will disarm to comply with this law not to do so. As Chris touched on, a good lot of these folks, will voluntarily comply with a property's rules about not bringing firearms on there because they respect that. The type B person who seeks to do harm will not follow these rules at all. We think that's a given. So we've heard a lot lately about threats and civil unrest and violence and sort of the general bad behavior of people towards one another these days. And we think this should not be understated. This is a very real thing. We can all see what's going on around us. We've certainly seen more than enough aggression and conflict over this country in the last few years, and especially in 2020. And we understand and respect everyone's desire to be protected. We believe people should be protected. Safety is a serious concern. However, we also believe that lawmakers and public servants and folks who enjoy working in a building that supplies that protection or that outsources that protection, we don't think they should be the only folks who are afforded that sort of thing, but that the average citizen should be as well and should be able to protect themselves if they need to. It's because of that same uncertainty that the world is a dangerous place that many people make the decision to secure their own personal safety by carrying a weapon. Whether it's a gun or a can of pepper spray or some other device, an exceptionally large number of Americans have realized that the police will not always be there to keep them safe. And in fact, the courts have ruled numerous times that the police are under no legal obligation to keep them safe. These people have accepted the responsibility for their own safety and have taken steps to enhance their personal security. And these are the people that we refer to as the type A people who will be most directly affected by this law. These considerations lead us to the second obvious question with looking at it from this perspective, which is, what are the potential costs of implementing such a law, or who stands to lose from all of this? I think we've already begun to cover this in our analysis, but apart from our two types of people who carry guns, we also, of course, have to analyze how this law will affect people who choose not to carry a gun or a weapon for personal protection, but they rely on the system to keep them safe. Considering again that the sort of the underlying theme that we've seen in this bill is that it kind of directly affects the folks that you don't have to worry about. We argue that there's little to be gained for the folks who rely on the system to keep them safe, other than the sense of security that comes from the idea of knowing that guns aren't allowed here. So, there's that. Additionally, we believe that there could be a potential to increase the risk and compromise the safety of everyone involved by applying this sort of policy. By removing the ability of good people to defend themselves, we remove the deterrence for bad people to do harm. And this is why we see mass shooters overwhelmingly target areas that are gun-free zones when looking to do as much harm to as many as possible. That's not a coincidence. The absence of a physical means to mitigate a hostile threat will always put those threatened at a greater risk. We believe that possibly the single greatest benefit to the right to keep and bear arms is often the most overlooked, and that's the deterrence factor. The killers, terrorists, extremist groups, and bullies of all shapes and sizes will always prey on those first whom they know to be defenseless. Therefore, we believe it is not unreasonable to assume that this law might possibly do harm by removing folks' ability to defend themselves. Simply put, we see this bill as sacrificing not only individual rights, but possibly public safety as well, to a false sense of security. And we like to mention all the time that Vermont has never required permission to carry a firearm, concealed or otherwise. We let visitors carry guns. We have never regulated that, and we are consistently one of the safest states in the nation. We like to talk about that all the time too, or we're in the top 3 every single year. And if we've established that S30 will likely have little or no influence on the person who carries a gun to do harm, but it criminalizes the good law-abiding people, then we're we have to conclude, I think, that this policy, it could be a net negative for everyone involved, except for potentially maybe the criminal. We can't support a bill that makes it a crime for good people to peacefully possess a tool for self-defense. The fact that it's been openly acknowledged that it will likely not deter those who seek to engage in aggression and violence, but deters those who proactively take measures to secure the safety of themselves and their families, kind of leaves us wondering, what's the point? If the goal is to harden security at certain locations against an existential threat, then we believe there are alternative measures that could be taken to do so. If the goal is to give property owners a mechanism to enforce their own rules, then could we possibly find a solution under an existing law or statute? And I think that's been talked about a good bit already, and I'm optimistic about that. Safety should be of primary importance to everyone, and we absolutely commend those who take it seriously. We're hoping that the committee will consider all options when working towards that goal, and that it might be accomplished without abridging the rights of good people to defend themselves. In closing, that's pretty much all I have for today. But in closing, I'd like to thank the committee for their time and consideration. And I know I've given sort of a broad and big picture testimony here, but we'd also like to request that if we do get more into the specifics of this, that Gun Owners of Vermont could possibly be included in those conversations as well. So, that's all I have for today. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Oh, Dick, you're muted.
I muted myself to keep the dog from disturbing the committee. I wanted to, my thought, and we haven't talked it over in committee yet, is to provide approximately, we will not hold a public hearing. I don't think that, I just don't see how I do that under Zoom, but giving your group, Chris Bradley, are you still there? Chris?
Yes, I am, sir.
Thinking about having a half an hour for Gun Owners of Vermont, a half an hour for Vermont Federation of Sportsmen Clubs, half an hour for Gun Sense Vermont, and there's another group that would get a half an hour, and you, as leaders of those groups, would decide who you hear from, who we hear from. Select, you could do 5 people for 30 minutes or 2 people for 15 each, or whatever you wanted to do. In lieu of a public hearing, because I don't, under Zoom practices and talking with staff and others, would be very difficult. So if we advance the bill, that would be my plan. And so if that helps with your question, Eric. And Chris, I know you asked about that as well.
Yes, I did. There seems to have been a precedent, and I should.
My earlier comment, I want to apologize publicly to anybody who heard that comment about a contest with you, Chris. I certainly didn't intend that to be a derogatory thing to you. I just felt like you and I were getting into something that I didn't want to continue on, and I felt that we were going to just keep hurling, and I don't intend to do that.
Senator, I apologize as well.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. And Senator Baruth, you have a question for the witness?
Just a quick question for Eric. Are you replacing Eddie Cutler?
Yes, sir. I replaced Eddie as the president of Gun Owners Vermont last January.
Okay. I just wanted to say that was very well spoken. You do Eddie proud.
Thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate that.
Senator White, and then
I
Senator.
was just going to say the same thing, because Eric mentioned how nervous he was and how he might stumble over his words, and he did not at all. You did a great job. Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Senator Benning.
So, yeah, you did do a great job, and don't worry about testifying in front of this group. We don't bite heads. I'm going to send this message
I
out.
say very often.
Not very often.
Not very often.
Eric, I want to send this message to you and to Chris, because I'm only starting to think in a different way about this bill. My initial reaction to this bill was very concerning because the descriptions that I heard for advancing it included statements about somebody wanting to feel safe somewhere. And when I balanced that against a constitutional right, I was feeling very queasy about how this was being approached. But I'm trying to figure out a possible method of compromise here, and I want to run this by both of you to take back and think about some. If I'm in a child care center in downtown Guildhall, and by the way, there are no child care centers in downtown Guildhall, because there's a whole nother argument about what we did in Essex County to child care systems. But if I'm opening a child care center in downtown Guildhall, I'm a good hour away from the nearest Vermont police officer. And if a private entity like that wanted to have somebody there with a weapon, I would be opposed to this bill for that very reason, because it carte blanche wipes out their ability to do that. But I want you to think about, conversely, does a private enterprise like that have the right to put a sign out front that says no weapons? And if we put teeth into 3705 that enabled an officer to remove someone in violation of that, is that something you are comfortable with? And I don't expect you to answer that right now. In fact, I would prefer that you had the time to just think about that, because if I sense some way of bridging a gap, it is to be able to say that any entity, frankly, could be able to put such a sign out front. You would have the right to go there or not go there, your choice. But your exercise of a constitutional right would not override an entity's right to say, we have the right to govern what's going on inside our facility. That's a tough question. I'm just asking you to put that in the back of your head and roll with it for a while.
I think that's an important conversation to be had, Senator, for sure.
I think that's the conversation, particularly about hospitals, Joe. And I thank you for bringing that up, Joe. Senator Baruth.
2 points about what Senator Benning just said. First, S30 wouldn't prevent the ability to have law enforcement or security on the premises because there is an exemption for on-duty law enforcement to be conducting their operations. So a school resource officer, for instance, is allowed on school property under a similar exemption. So there's that. If I understand where the discussion around 3705 is going, I would imagine that ultimately Chris and Eric and their people would realize that what Joe is proposing is far more expansive and far more detrimental to gun owners' rights than S30. In other words, if I understand what Joe is saying, he would give all private entities in Vermont the ability to put a sign out that would constitute a legal trespass notice, and somebody who brought a gun in then would be criminally liable. So it would make an infinite number of gun-free zones, whereas S30 is limiting it to 3. So I'm not stopping that conversation from going anywhere, but it would amaze me if gun owners of Vermont were willing to sign on to what Joe's talking about, because it would give every location in Vermont the ability to declare themselves a gun-free zone with a criminal penalty for violating it.
That's basically why I suggested to both of them to take that and think about it.
Okay. I just found out that Jennifer Fitch has to leave at 10 o'clock. So I wonder if we would mind having Jennifer speak now, and then I mean, maybe if Eric and Chris, do you have to go anywhere right away?
No, sir.
I can stick around.
You're like me, you're stuck here today. So if we could go to Jennifer and then come back to this conversation. Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had to leave. Go ahead, Jennifer. Jennifer is the new Commissioner of Buildings and General Services. Welcome to, I don't know if Senator Benning's had his confirmation hearing yet, but we're going to assume you're in good shape. So thank you for coming and welcome to Senate Judiciary.
Thank you, Senator Sears, and I certainly hope Joe Benning is in support of me as the BGS Commissioner. As you stated, my name is Jennifer Fitch. I am the BGS Commissioner, and I'm here today to specifically talk about S30 as it relates to BGS and our buildings. My testimony today will be short. So per 29 VSA Section 152, the BGS Commissioner is empowered to adopt rules governing firearms while in state buildings. Per State Facility Rule number 5 that was established around 2000, guns are prohibited or firearms are prohibited in state buildings with the exception of law enforcement officers. This rule has been working really well for us since early 2000s. And at this point, I don't feel a necessity to either modify the rule that currently exists or a necessity for this bill in terms of the purposes of BGS at this time.
Well, that was pretty short.
That's why she'll be confirmed by the Institutions Committee.
Okay. Are there any questions for Jennifer? Have you had any problems with not necessarily in the State House, where we know there's been some issues over the years, particularly during the governors, not this governor, but prior governors? Have you had any problems in other buildings?
In the last 4 years since I've been at BGS, I am not aware of any gun incidences within our buildings.
So any government building that's owned by the state of Vermont or leased, they're already prohibited. Is that correct?
That is correct. Both state-owned and leased, whatever buildings fall underneath the jurisdiction of BGS.
Okay. Senator Baruth, you had a question.
I'm just vaguely remembering an incident, and now the pandemic has screwed up my sense of time, but I wanted to say it was the summer before last, or maybe it was, but there was someone who was reported to have gone into one of the government buildings with a long gun. And then there was a question, they couldn't find such a person. Are you remembering that?
Yeah, that was
I
the
am. You're
tax
talking
building.
about the incident at 133 that did occur.
Yes.
Your memory is correct. And in that particular incident, everything worked as it should have. Somebody was suspected of bringing a long rifle into a building. Enforcement was notified immediately. Capitol Police was the first to respond on the scene, then shortly followed by Montpelier PD. And in that case, it was handled very well. And at the end of the day, we found that it wasn't a long gun. In fact, it was an umbrella.
Mm-hmm. That's what I thought. I remember an alert that went out or something like that.
That is correct.
I think highlighting, what would you do if, have there been incident, if there were an incident, what measures would you take at a building that was not covered by security? Such as, not the pavilion, but rather maybe the office of the Secretary of State or auditor.
So as part of our program at BGS, we install physical security measures inside all of our state facilities, including leased and owned, as I indicated earlier. The types of systems that we put in include card access, right? So you have your badge, you got to swipe in. It also includes cameras in some of our facilities, and it also includes panic buttons and lockdown buttons. So even when we don't have a security guard in a building, or there isn't a law enforcement officer in a building, there is infrastructure that our state employees can use to notify local enforcement, lock the building down, utilize a panic button, those types of things. So we have all of those measures in our buildings.
Senator Benning, then Senator White.
So Jennifer, with respect to government buildings and this bill's covering of government buildings, do I hear you correctly that you're saying it's not necessary?
It's not necessary for us at BGS, that is correct, because we already have, pursuant to 29 BSA section 152, I already can govern guns in my state facilities.
Thank you.
Senator White.
So if that umbrella had in fact turned out to be a long gun, that you were still doing the same thing. And just because if we had passed this bill, that wouldn't have prohibited the person from entering with his gun any more than your signs. So I'm just
well, because of the prohibition, right? It allows us to take action immediately. So
right.
So I guess I have what I need at BGS to regulate guns within my state facilities. Therefore, I don't find this bill to be a necessity to BGS.
Good. Yep. That was.
Senator Baruth, and then I have one question. Hopefully we can get you out of here by 10.
This is not so much a question for Ms. Fitch, but I understand that there are lawmakers who carry within the State House. And I've heard that for years. And I've also heard that at least one of those persons argues that the posted rule does not contravene his right to carry a firearm. So I think part of the intent of S30 is to stiffen the authority behind the rules that the commissioner is pointing to. I agree, having rules in place can work, but if it runs up against a person or a movement that declares that only state law contravenes their right, then I think it does give us an additional authority at that point. But I take the commissioner's testimony and we'll leave it at that.
I'd like to leave you with one thought, Commissioner, as well as Senator Benning, to look at. And that is the disparity in state office buildings. And I'll use Bennington as an example. The Bennington State Office Building has sheriffs if you enter the foyer to go either to a courtroom or any office, with one exception, in that building, whether it be Department of Labor, Department of Children and Families, or the courts. So you've gone through a metal detector and everything. you get into probation and parole, you don't go through any of those. You have to go through your normal security that you have. But there have been assaults of staff at probation and parole. And it's a complaint that I've heard from other state employees in other parts of the state where there isn't the same level of security in some as others. So I hope that the institutions committee and you're, as a new commissioner, will take a look at that problem. It seems to be a disparity, and many state office employees have noted that to me. It may have nothing to do with this bill, but it is a concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your
I think
time.
we have you out of here at 10. Yeah, thank you. Were we still, have we finished with Mr. Davis? I think we have. Yeah. Eric, thank you for your testimony. You're welcome to hang here in the meeting and listen to Commissioner Sherling, who's our next witness of Department of Public Safety. Mike, good to have you with us.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I think
thank you for making time. I know you're flat out with various things.
It's a little brisk. I think I will also be probably as brief as Commissioner Fitch. For the record, Mike Sherling, Commissioner of Public Safety. We're here to provide any requisite background the committee might need. I think Commissioner Fitch touched on a couple of the key points. There are no known incidents in state buildings involving firearms in recent history. She touched on their regulatory posture, and I think other witnesses have touched on some of the other tools that are used in circumstances where property owners have opted to post and prohibit firearms on premise under existing statutes. I would, of course, note for the record the recent uptick in threats to government buildings is pretty widely publicized. So that's a piece of background information for the committee to certainly consider. I would also note that the prohibition itself, if you're looking to achieve security at any given location, the prohibition itself is a piece of a larger fabric of security precautions, some of which the commissioner mentioned are in place at some state buildings, screening tools, and then ultimately what what the back end looks like if someone's found to have a prohibited item, whether that's a firearm or something else. Those are really the key considerations from our perspective. We don't have a particular position on this bill that we've developed. I would note one last thing, which is sort of tangential, and note that the bill is crafted as a potential new misdemeanor. There are limited options in terms of what law enforcement can do with witnessed misdemeanors, given the evolution of the rules of arrest, Rule 3 in particular, that the legislature has undertaken in recent years. So the tool set available, even if this were to become a new crime, is relatively limited.
Could I, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Could I just ask for a clarification? I wasn't sure at the end. You referenced, Commissioner, a rule or a law that I'm not familiar with. What, if you could just unpack that last part a little bit?
Certainly. The Vermont Rules of Criminal Procedure, specifically Rule 3, outlines when a physical arrest, custody of a person can occur subsequent to a probable cause existing for a particular violation. The circumstances under which law enforcement can take physical custody of a person versus releasing them on a citation to appear at a later date are severely constrained by Rule 3. So that's something that you'd have to take a look at if you were to go down the road of creating a new misdemeanor and wanting to actually, physically incapacitate someone who might be posing a perceived threat as a result of violation of S30, they're inextricably linked.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say also, I really appreciated your approach during the recent, alert that state capitals were under. I felt like we were all very well briefed. I felt personally the situation was very much in hand. So just hats off to your department.
Thank you.
If I might, before, I see Senator White has a question, but for Eric Fitzpatrick. Eric, when we get to committee discussion, can you do a little research on what Commissioner Sherling just spoke about in terms of Rule 3 and the ability to enforce a minor misdemeanor, which I believe this is a year maximum sentence, and it is considered a misdemeanor. So what is, I'm assuming that an officer could tell the person to leave the building, but what else could one do? So if you could look at that as well, Eric, please.
Sure, will do. I think if it's witnessed, it's okay, but I'll follow up on that.
If it's witnessed, it can be arrest.
Yes.
Would you follow up on that, please? And
Yep.
Senator White, you had a question, then Senator Benning.
Well, I was just going to ask Commissioner, does Rule 3 only apply to misdemeanors? Because surely if somebody is presenting a threat, an obvious threat with their fire, I mean, there would be a difference between just having the firearm and presenting some kind of a threat. So does Rule 3 only apply to misdemeanors or when there isn't an active threat?
No, it applies to everything, Senator, and the Ledge Council is accurate. A witnessed misdemeanor has greater latitude, but what we're envisioning will typically happen is, unless someone is an active shooter and forcing their way in, which you have a whole different problem
Right.
at that point. They're going to be turned away at the door, or they might step inside and then be removed. And then when law enforcement arrives, it is no longer a witnessed misdemeanor. It occurred prior to their arrival. So in the event you've got fragments of information that indicate that the person was trying to gain access and has some underlying criminogenic or mental health or other issue, the constraints on further action are significant.
Thanks.
Am I correct that in terms of state buildings, there already is a rule in effect? And so unless the person is exhibiting behavior that would indicate that they're a threat to occupants of that building, they're already not allowed to carry firearms in the state building.
That's correct. And that's the rule that Commissioner Fitch was talking about. So the way that an enforcement action might play out is a person's prohibited. They choose to go inside with a firearm. They're asked to leave. They refuse to leave. It becomes a trespass under 3705.
Thank you. Senator Benning and then Senator White again.
Commissioner, you've been in law enforcement for a long time. Have you ever actually cited someone for that very series of events?
Not that I can recall. There certainly have been a myriad of trespass cases, as you can attest, Senator, on a variety of different topics and refusals to leave premises. I don't recall one that's related to a firearm in the cross section of events that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Like Senator Baruth indicated, COVID has not only bent time, but reality and memory in many ways.
How many years have you been in law enforcement now?
31.
Okay.
On and off. I had a hiatus there in commerce, which I enjoyed very much.
Okay, thanks.
Senator White.
So let me get this straight. So somebody comes in, they're carrying a gun in a state building where it's posted, and there's a rule against it. They refuse to leave. Then you can cite them under 3705. So would that not be also true for a non-government building, that a hospital, for example, that had their rule about not carrying a gun in there, and somebody came in and they refused to leave? Could they also not be cited under 3705?
They could, Senator. That rubric exists for anyone who's lawfully asked to leave any premises.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Baruth.
I'm remembering the opinion that Eric issued the committee, and I believe it was a contrary opinion to what we're hearing. So I know that the chair wants to save that for the end, but I think we're running the risk of not being able to question the witnesses with regard to that opinion. So I just note that.
I'm not familiar with that opinion, Senator, so I can't.
No,
speak
it was
to potential
issued
conflict.
just to the committee.
Because you're going to be taking over the committee in 3 minutes while I go to health and welfare, we have one other witness before the 10:30 break, and that's Chief Romy, but you're welcome, Senator.
Romy, aye.
Romy, aye. I'm going to, I stand corrected, Senator White. Thank you for your, Commissioner Sherling, thank you for your, oh my God, he's at a beach in the Caribbean with a palm tree behind him. I'm already jealous. Looks like a beautiful day out there, Chief Romy. So you're taking over, Senator Baruth. Thank you very much. I'll be back.
Thank you. Have a good day.
As soon as I can. Thank you.
Okay. Chief Romy, I welcome.
Good morning, senators and other treasured guests. Matthew Romy, Capitol Police Chief. And the first thing I'd like to do, and unfortunately they're gone already, but I would like to thank the Commissioner of Public Safety for breaking the bad news to you about Rule 3. He probably explained it much better than I can. I'm still adjusting to the idiosyncrasies of Vermont procedure, even though, believe it or not, I've been up here almost 4 years now as your police chief. I have given Peggy and Senator Sears a memorandum that I won't drag you all through, because I think that for the most part, many of those things have been addressed already today. But I did explain, just for clarity, how the Capitol Police functions in the sphere of dealing with firearms. I would like to note that no one currently in the Capitol Police Department or the Sergeant-at-Arms office is aware of a carriage of weapons in the building incident, if you will. There's been the rumor mill swirls, and I've heard them, other officers have heard them, but we have not had any incidents since I've been there with members at all. And we know for sure that even Sergeant Manning is the longest currently serving Capitol Police officer, and he is not aware of any in the history of the Capitol Police Department. So that goes back to 99. We, in this kind of world, really in everything we do, we work through a lens of First Amendment protections. So we have to look at any enforcement action that we take in the Capitol Police Department, whether it's in the State House, on the lawn in another state building. We have to make sure that we steer clear of any First Amendment grounds. There is an outline in that memo about some of the relevant statutes and rules, because it is different. We have rules in the State House which are different than rules in other state buildings, different than rules and a law in the Supreme Court building that prevents the carriage of firearms. And then we have a couple of sets of rules actually that govern the lawn. And so we deal with weapons in each of those different places, or we would deal with weapons in each of those places somewhat differently. Senator Bruce, you were correct. The first thing that we would always do with someone, as long as they're capable of de-escalation and conversation, we would certainly try to reason with them. I think that's something that we want to do with anyone that we can. But if we were alerted to someone carrying a firearm in the building, we would ask them if they are. We would make sure they're not law enforcement there on an official visit, and if they're not, we would ask them to take it back out to their car and lock it up, secure it, and come on back in and enjoy the rest of the day. There are many state houses. I sort of anticipated a question regarding this. There are many state houses across the country where the carriage of concealed weapons by citizens is permitted within the building. There are some rules and some procedures that govern that. For instance, the Florida State House, which has 4 separate law enforcement agencies working within it. If you present your concealed carry permit from the state of Florida or from another state that Florida recognizes to the screening station, they hand you a card about where you can and cannot take it and what you can and cannot do with it in the building and what you're responsible for, and they welcome you to the Florida Capitol. Caveat to that, that's how it was 18 months ago when we visited. I don't believe anything's changed down there, but there are several state houses that do permit that. When we go into other state buildings, there's a tri-branch MOU that kind of negotiates procedures within the Capitol complex. When we are conveyed the authority to enforce BGS rules in BGS buildings and on the grounds, when we go into those grounds, absent an active violent situation, we defer to BGS or their representative, which is usually in the form of BGS security. And if they want the person removed from the building, we'll have them instruct them to leave. And if they don't, then we're back to a 3705 trespass arrest. Same thing for the Supreme Court. We are over there fairly routinely to assist judicial security with issues that they may have going on. There is a particular state law, 13 VSA 4016, that prohibits the carriage of firearms in the courts, and we would certainly make an arrest on that if we needed to. The lawn is an interesting conundrum for us. It is a First Amendment sanctuary place, if you will. It is holy ground considering the First Amendment, and the rules are actually ratcheted back in that place where there is not a prohibition against carrying firearms. There's a discouragement, and that discouragement is in the set of rules that BGS sends out to people that book the lawn. Our practice has been, and this was something we took from Montpelier Police that seemed to work well for them out there. If we see someone, carrying a long gun slung across their back, we approach them, engage with them. We're usually able to break down the barriers pretty quick. We encourage them to take it and secure it in their car. And if they are adamantly intent on exercising their rights, we give them some do's and don'ts, and we explain to them what will get them sideways with us, namely that slung weapon coming off their shoulder. There is a current state statute, and this is one of those additional things that you may wish to consider with this, of aiming a gun at another. It is the first offense fine is $50, and if you discharge
Really?
it,
If you aim a gun at someone, it's $50?
Any person, it's 13 VSA 4011, any person intentionally point or aim a gun, pistol, or other firearm, except in self-defense and the lawful discharge of duty, fine not exceeding $50. And if you discharge it, punished by imprisonment for not more than 1 year, fine more than $100. I would submit that if you discharge a firearm at another person, that's not the statute that I would look to charge you with. It would be an attempted murder. But you know, it's interesting. Sometimes finding some of these statutes, I don't actually. It doesn't have a note in there about when that statute was passed. I suspect it might be a little older. There is another statute that may apply with these things, with the conversation you're currently having, and that's the carrying dangerous weapons. It would require us to it would require us to prove intent to harm, and that's a 2-year felony. If the person intends to injure multiple persons, such as in a mass shooting or something, it's a felony punishable by not more than 10 years or $25,000. So there are some other things we can apply to these situations should we need to. One interesting thing that I did want to bring to the committee's attention, and again, in my memo, I'll tell you the Capitol Police take no position on this bill. We rarely take a position on any legislation, but we want you to understand how it would affect us in the operation of the State House and the greater Capitol complex. One thing that I know Senator Benning is dreading is the conversation concerning screening in the State House. And one of the things that Legislative Council has previously identified to me as a barrier to screening in not only the State House, but in government buildings that are not a courthouse or part courthouse, is that it's not illegal to carry a weapon in the building. So we can't actually search you for things that aren't illegal. And, in a fundamental way, I understand that. So this bill is drafted right now, I believe, and I should have said this at the beginning, I'm not a lawyer and I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. So please take your legal guidance from others. But I believe that this would probably lower that barrier to us implementing a screening program at the State House. I will follow that up immediately by telling you that is by far not the only barrier, but it appears to be the only legal barrier for us to screen in the building. There is a modification that begins on line 13, and I'm sorry I didn't put the page number, but I think I want to say it may be one of the first modifications, but it's the line that says it's currently in use for the performance of essential government functions. And I would just ask you to think for a moment that if we were to implement a screening program at the State House, which, again, not saying we should or we shouldn't, it's a discussion for another day, we probably couldn't screen during Farmers Night because that's not an essential government function, or it would still be going on through the pandemic, is kind of my train of thought with this, right? So if we don't screen when people are coming in during Farmers Night, and the way our building is constructed, they could come in and secrete anything, not secret, I apologize, something in the building for use later. So it would minimize the effectiveness of that screening program.
Chief, if I could just ask,
sure.
When we were in the building, and particularly when there was a State of the State address, there was screening, or I'm remembering wrong, and yet you seem to be saying that you couldn't do screening. How does it work on that day?
So we don't screen on that day. We do bag checks, and
so you mean a metal detector kind of thing?
Correct. We do bag checks, and we have deputies at the doors to discourage the entry with unauthorized things. For instance, last year during the State of the State that was interrupted by the protest, quite frankly, it shows how a screening program would be beneficial in some cases, because we were able to prevent that group from bringing in pots and pans that they were intending on using for their disruption. So much like a lot of things that we talk about, things like screening programs have a butterfly effect. And we see that a couple of days out of the year, but we take the extraordinary step of doing bag checks and having those deputies on the doors during those large events because of the enormous risk that we take by having the entirety of government in one place, which is a huge risk. One other thing I would like to mention, there's a modification there's the exemption that applies to legitimate law enforcement purposes, whether the officer is on or off duty. And it seems to me to sort of contradict itself, because I wouldn't want an officer doing legitimate law enforcement purposes off duty. However, one of the interesting things that this brings up is a problem that we have seen with the guns on school property and the guns in schools statute. And that particular, I'm trying to bring it back up for some reason. I can't seem to find it. I have that tab somewhere. Possession of a dangerous weapon in the school bus or on the school building or on school property. And that already prohibits the carriage of firearms on school property, and it does not apply to the exemption in there is a law enforcement officer while engaged in law enforcement duties. And basically what that means is that I violate that statute twice a day. When I drop my children off at school and when I pick them up in the afternoon, because I'm not engaged in official law enforcement duties while I'm doing that. However, we have taken the stance that you would absolutely want me to be armed and prepared to react should something happen in that school while I'm on my way to work or home, or while I'm dropping them off or picking them up. So I think that's an unfortunate exemption over in that statute. And I would certainly like to see that exemption in this statute, kind of cleared up to help us through that. An interesting thing when you look at the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act in the U.S. Code is it does not apply to persons carrying with persons possessing a concealed carry permit. So, for instance, when I lived in Alabama, my wife had a concealed carry permit from Alabama. So that Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act exempted her from the restriction against carrying on school property when she dropped the kids off or picked them up. So there was a nod towards that permitting process, and it would also exempt, of course, law enforcement. The last thing I guess I'll just mention is that, without, and this kind of goes back to what Commissioner of Public Safety said, we can pass the you could pass the statute. I say we, the royal we, Vermont, could have the statute, but it's not going to change the safety of the occupants absent a comprehensive full-time screening program. We are strictly reactive in the State House right now. We don't have anything that would prevent you from coming in there. We're also not alone in that. There's 6 or 7. It kind of changes a little bit every year. State houses across the country that don't have any screening methods. We can take a long dive down the road of what it may be appropriate for us or may be inappropriate for us. But without a comprehensive screening program, a bill such as this is almost like an add-on charge, much like the seatbelt law. I've stopped you for speeding, but I'm going to add a secondary violation of a seatbelt act. So this would be one that with very few exceptions, I don't think would be applied, except in the case of we have something else going on. Oh, and we're going to add this one on as well. Alabama, right before I left, and I say right before I left, it was 20. They did it in 2015, and they came back and amended it in 2018. They actually passed a Prohibited Places Act, such as this. And I found that statute very interesting from a citizen standpoint as well as a professional standpoint. And one of the things I found interesting about it was that, as you were saying, the price shopper down the street can decide that it doesn't want me to shop there with a firearm. And it's my decision whether or not I carry in there or not. The interesting thing that they did down there was that if you had a concealed carry permit, a place of public access like a grocery store or a gas station, those kind of things, could not prohibit you from carrying on their property unless they posted the doors and had a screening program in place. And it seemed to me as a citizen with that, it seemed to me that if they're taking away, for instance, I think of my wife a lot. She reminds me to think of her if I fail to think of her. Is that if you're going to take away her right of self-defense, you have to protect her when she's there. They included some interesting things in there about if you're an employer, you can't prohibit firearms and personal vehicles on your property because your employees have a right to defend themselves between work and home. So I found those interesting. And, again, I'm not saying that y'all should do anything like that. I just think it's interesting within the discussion process.
I just, before I turn it back over to Senator Sears, I just wanted to respond to the on or off duty. I agree that should be looked at, that piece. Personally, one of the things that I find most troubling about what happened at the Capitol was as they begin to charge these people, there are, I think, 400 active cases. It's turning out that many of them are off-duty police officers, retired military, active duty military, and that's within the group that were the most coordinated and violent at the U.S. Capitol. So I think sometimes people think of off-duty police officers, and you cited yourself as somebody who should be allowed to use their weapon in case they are at a school and something happens. But I would just caution us, there's growing evidence of radicalization in police forces, military, National Guard, etc. And so any provision that would allow those people to carry off duty seems to me to be really asking for trouble these days.
Senator Sears.
Yes, go ahead. I would prefer to have Senator Baruch continue. I'm
Okay.
sorry I missed most of your testimony, and then when the committee's finished with the chief, I'll take.
Okay, I know we're hard on a break, but Senator White.
So I just wanted to ask the chief about that, about the off-duty and on-duty, because if we don't allow it for off-duty, then your contention, I thought I misheard, I either misheard you or I misunderstood you, that when you drop your kids off, you're off-duty, and yet you are carrying, so you would be in violation of that. So is that in conflict with what Senator Baruch just said about removing the off-duty, because you're not on duty when you're dropping your kids off?
Well, I think globally we've looked at our law enforcement officers, and to Senator Baruch's point, yes, there were a few law enforcement officers and military members that took part in the January 6th invasion of the U.S. Capitol. I would temper your view of that to look at the raw numbers in comparison to the numbers of law enforcement officers across America. I'm not even sure what our current population of law enforcement officers is, but just like there's bad teachers and bad politicians and bad high school students, there's going to be a few bad cops out there. The numbers just don't allow there not to be. I think the overwhelming majority of law enforcement, especially here in Vermont, are stand-up, good quality people. And I think about the density of law enforcement in Vermont, and to Senator Benning's point about places being an hour or more away from the nearest on-duty police officer. We just do not have the density of law enforcement officers here on duty at any one time, and we rely so much on the ability and the willingness of our law enforcement officers to respond to things when they're not on duty. I know our department takes a stance that unless you are intoxicated or otherwise unable to discharge your duties, we consider you to be a sworn law enforcement officer and support your ability to carry your weapon.
Well, if I could just cut in, we've had this discussion many times in Senate Education, and people have advanced the argument unsuccessfully that off-duty police officers should be allowed to, if they are on school grounds, in effect act as a resource officer. And I have to say, I think it's in other words, if they perceive trouble, they should be allowed to go in with their firearm. And I've always opposed that, because I've never written a gun safety bill that didn't have an exemption for active duty or on duty, because I think that's important. But there was a push some years back to allow retired or off duty to carry on school grounds. And I think that would be, in effect, just getting rid of the prohibition on weapons. So I know we're supposed to, 1 second, I just want to ask the chair, Mr. Chair, so we're 10 minutes past our break time.
Yep.
I don't want to cut into the other witnesses. What would you like to do?
I'd like to have I just messed up. Back to full screen. I would like to have a full discussion in committee, and if there's continued questions for Chief Romey. Did I get it right?
No, Romey, aye.
Romey, aye.
Romey, aye. I will.
Like Romeo.
I'm sure we can get him back from his tropical vacation to continue the discussion. I think we need further committee discussion on this bill. A number of issues have come up that lead me to, I could not support the bill as currently constituted, given some of the testimony I've heard and some of the concerns. But I remain concerned about people carrying weapons in places where they might. So I'd like to continue the committee discussion, hear our testimony that we've set up, and then get to the heart of some of these issues. Rule 30 with Eric and 3705. I'm better understanding some of these things and having a full discussion with the committee. Senator White.
Can I just respond to something that Senator Baruth just said about the schools? And I understand if you want to have the discussion about schools, but my understanding of law enforcement officers in Vermont is that when they're sworn as a level 3 officer, they're assumed to be capable of responding to something, whether they are on or off duty. So if you're in bed in the middle of the night and there's murder happening down the street from you and you're called, my understanding is that that is a duty of sworn law enforcement officers in Vermont. And I might be wrong, but I will check that out just to make sure, because
if you're called, then you're on.
What?
I was going to say, if you're called to the scene, then you're on duty.
Well, if you're, I think that there are some nuances in there, but
I'm going to say that I think the witnesses today have brought up some issues with the effort that weren't there when we dealt with schools way back when, but we look at school security today. When we first said that you can't carry a firearm into a school or into a courtroom, times have changed, and looking at this bill, and I think that to give due deference, I want to hear from the League of Cities and Towns and the other witnesses we have left for today, and then do some serious committee discussion. And as I said, also have opportunity for the four groups to provide testimony to the committee on ideas. Senator Benning.
Just so you know, Senator Sears, Matt Valerio has been listening to this conversation, especially with respect to the law enforcement officers' descriptions of some of the rules in criminal procedure. He's sent me an email. I've copied you all with that. If the continuing conversation leads us to go down that path, he would like an opportunity to talk about it.
Okay. With that, why don't we take a break until about 5 minutes of 11, and we'll pick up with I'll get the right one. Devin Green and Karen Horn and Kagan Mays Williams.
Great. Can everybody mute and shut your video off, please?
Yeah,
Thank you.
before I do, Peggy, can I talk with you briefly?
Yep. We're on YouTube. Is that okay?
Yeah, I don't care who.
Okay.
I
Yep,
mean,
of course.
It's not a big secret. I just wanted to give you some idea what I was looking at for an agenda item.
Yep, of course.
When I talked about DCF, I would like I'm going to call it a roundtable discussion about aggressive behavior with juveniles in the juvenile justice system. And I start with having DCF, Department of Mental Health, Department of Aging and Independent Living, John Campbell, Marshall Paul, somebody from Beckett and somebody from Seal.
From where? What was the last one?
Depot Street.
What's it called?
204 Depot.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Jim Henry.
Oh, okay. Yep.
And just have a kind of a table discussion. Call it a roundtable discussion. I don't know if you get a round table, but given the aggressive behavior of some of the that has become a danger to staff as well as residents of the staff, not just inside programs. We had that case in the hotel that they described yesterday. Be a discussion about some of the aggressive behaviors that they're seeing with juveniles and how to deal with it.
And when do you want this to happen?
Well, I don't know how our agenda is for next week, but as we look at the agenda for next week would be okay, or the following week.
So during a committee meeting time, right?
Yeah,
Yep.
Say 2 hours.
Okay.
Like a 9 to 11 or something or 10 to 12 on a Tuesday or whatever.
Okay, so my guess will be the week after, but let me see if I can fit in what you want for next week, and then we can look at the week after. Okay.
All right.
Sounds good.
I'll see you 5 minutes.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Oh, okay. Yep. 10 minutes. I'm sorry. I thought we. Okay.
Sounds good.
Hello. I don't think I have my, oh, I don't.
We can hear you.
You'd think I'd never been in a meeting before. I forgot my earplugs. And I'm saying, why can't I hear these people? This is getting, I don't know how much longer we're going to be able to Zoom.
Well, we're almost into February.
I know. I think we're going to actually be Zooming the entire session. So
I think so too.
I don't see any way out of it.
Zoom used to have a much more fun meeting.
Seeing as how we have the hospital association here, I can say that with some certainty that it doesn't look like we're going to have mass vaccinations by the end of May.
Yeah, if we had more vaccines, it wouldn't be a problem, but
Right.
That is the limiting factor right now.
Or if
Yeah,
some of us could get signed up. I can't.
Well,
get signed up.
I don't know why you're having such problems, Senator White. I thought you were technologically advanced beyond me. I went in there Monday morning and signed right up and had an appointment on February 8th with absolutely no problem. And except checking the little box that I forgot to check 3 times and going back and saying, well, why the hell did they ask for this little box to be checked?
So I went in and it said, so I got my account set up. And then it said, choose a location, and I chose a location. And then it said, event, February 8th. I didn't know what that meant. It didn't ask me any questions. So then it kicked me out. So then I tried to go back in using my email and my password, and it says, sorry, no such person exists. So then I went in to sign up again, thinking maybe I'd screwed it up, and it said, sorry, but there's already a person who exists with that name. So I'm not signed up yet. I don't know how to do it.
I think you should call the Department of Health and get help. But I will say,
did, and I was on
there is a problem in our district.
And then it hung up, and then I got back on.
Oh.
I was on for another 20 minutes, and they hung up on me again.
Well, there is a problem in our district, and that's the location of, particularly in the mountain towns, Wilmington, Dover, and those areas where we need to get. I guess they did adopt Grace Cottage, but some of those folks are going to have to travel a lot longer than 30 minutes to get there.
Mm-hmm. We only have 4 locations in the southern counties,
right.
And we have 25% of the population.
Well, do we really?
Mm-hmm.
I think we have about, you mean Bennington and Rutland, or you mean Bennington, Rutland, Bennington, Wyndham?
That's what we were told yesterday. And Dr.
I don't think we're 25%. I think we're about 15% at most. Otherwise, we'd have more senators.
Yeah, well, we're not going to have any senators next time.
Right. Okay. Anyhow, I guess we can get back to our committee meeting on S30. And are we ready to get going, Peggy? Our first witness is Devin Green from the Vermont Hospital Association.
Yep.
Vermont Association. She can tell us who she represents.
Yes. Good morning, Devin Green from the Vermont Association of Hospitals and Health Systems. We represent all of Vermont's hospitals, and they are all nonprofit and mission-based entities. Thank you for having me in today to testify on S30. I will say, when I was preparing for this testimony, I was taken back to the fall of 2017 when I received an emergency email that there was an active shooter at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, and that patients would have to be diverted to other hospitals. A couple weeks after that, I talked to one of the ICU nurses who had been there during the shooting, and she was clearly traumatized by the event. Now, this is an ICU nurse, so she's seen a lot of things, but this really shook her. So with that, VAS is happy to support S30. It makes a lot of sense because knowing that what happened at Dartmouth Hitchcock could easily happen across the river in Vermont. We want to support this. It allows patients, visitors, and healthcare workers to secure their firearms in their car with less chance of conflict for the people who are working at the hospitals. It's hard to ask someone to put their firearm away when you're working at the hospital. And this will give hospital workers something to point to that's in the law. Earlier, Eric Davis testified that there are two different types of people carrying weapons, law-abiding and those with criminal intent. I would say that in a hospital situation, there's another individual you need to consider, which is the individual who is in an altered mental state. This could be either through psychosis or use of substances. We have a lot of hospital workers who have seen individuals in an altered mental state grab for a weapon from a law enforcement officer. Now, a law enforcement officer knows what to do in that situation, but a regular law-abiding citizen carrying a weapon may not know what to do. And so we think that that could create a danger for patients and loved ones in the hospital who are already in an incredibly vulnerable situation. S30 would also help protect healthcare workers. As an emotionally charged environment, hospitals hold a high risk of injury to healthcare workers. In 2018, according to US Bureau of Labor Statistics, healthcare workers comprise 73% of all non-fatal workplace injuries and illnesses due to violence. So that's 73% of all the injuries that were non-fatal were put upon healthcare workers. This law would help ensure, now it wouldn't protect those healthcare workers from injury, but it would help ensure that those injuries are not lethal and due to firearms. S30 will also protect lives outside of the hospital. As the Dartmouth Hitchcock shooting showed, the repercussions do not end at one hospital. If a hospital goes into lockdown, patients must be diverted to other hospitals in the area. And in emergency situations, those extra minutes could be the difference between life and death. Please consider voting in favor of S30, and I thank you for your consideration.
I have a couple of questions, Devin, and I appreciate your being here this morning. First is, are all hospitals in favor of this bill, or do we have
Yes.
divergent views? So every hospital in the state is supportive of this bill.
Yes.
Secondly, have we, I was amazed at how I had to try to get inside the Rutland Hospital, what I had to go through for an appointment in one of the medical offices there. And now that we're having screening for people going into any hospital, that take my temperature and all that, fairly automatic unless it's a real emergency. I've been able to go right into the emergency room. I think people are able to get in a little easier. I'm wondering there seems to always be security now at the front doors of our hospitals. And that was one of the issues Mr. Davis brought up earlier in his testimony about having that and people feeling the need to be able to defend themselves and why they carry. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, there is security at hospitals. And at most, if not all hospitals at this point, there is security there. So I would say that does go to what was brought up earlier in the testimony.
What about, I believe, I hope I didn't dream it, but I believe there was a hospital in Vermont where I heard from them that a patient who had a gun was using that gun in a way at this hospital to try to procure opiates. that an actual incident, or was that something that somebody made up? Do you know?
I do not know. I definitely have heard incidents of patients reaching for guns from law enforcement officers. I've heard from several chief medical officers about those incidents. I have not heard about that one.
Okay. Senator White?
Thanks, Devin. So do the hospitals feel that they have no other ability to do this? Because one of the things we've been hearing is that if you put up a sign that says no weapons allowed, and somebody is confronted and asked to get rid of their weapon, they may do it or they may refuse to do it. And if they refuse to do it, that it can constitute an illegal trespass under 3705. So I'm curious as to why the hospitals would not use that to get people off the premises if they had a gun.
So first of all, I'm not sure if they all know that is what I think they all have policies to not have weapons in their hospitals. I think, it would just be much easier to point and less conflict to point to a law and say, this is something that the state is imposing as opposed to what the hospital is trying to do. I think with the hospital, people are coming in for illnesses. It gets emotionally charged. Staff is stretched thin. And so this would provide greater protection than having to, it may lessen the conflict to be able to point to this instead of just a policy.
No, but the policy could be backed up with that other law. So, but
if you gave some teeth to it, I mean, right now, I agree with Senator Benning, it would need more teeth. But we would not necessarily be opposed to that proposal either.
Thanks.
Senator Sears?
Yes, Senator Benning.
Devin, do all hospitals in Vermont now have a sign out front that says no weapons?
I don't know. I can check on that.
I'd like to know.
Okay.
Thank you.
I know my hospital has a sign saying no weapons and no tobacco. So or it may say this is a tobacco-free campus, and I'm not sure which.
And actually, Devin, if I can follow up, I'm assuming you also have supervision over entities like here in my neck of the woods, Corner Medical, which is a smaller size facility, not a hospital. And if you do, I'd like to know whether there are similar signs out front of them as well.
I may not, but I don't know if that entity is hospital affiliated. If it is, I can check on that. If not, I can work with VMS to try to get the Vermont Medical Society to try to get that information.
I know this one is associated with NVRH. I'm assuming the Concord facility is the same way, but I'd like to know whatever you can find out. Thanks.
Other questions? Senator Baruth.
Not a question, although I thank Devin for being here. I would just say that if you look at the masking debate, I guess I would have to call it, there are a large number of people in Vermont and nationally who believe that it's unconstitutional for them to be told to wear a mask. And so we see, we see ongoing friction, violence in certain areas over this. And there is no amendment of the Constitution that protects against mask wearing. So when we're talking about firearms, we're talking about a group of gun owners who very fervently believe that their constitutional right will overcome a hospital's policy or a store's policy. And so just to reiterate, one of the things we're trying to do is say to those people, this is not an administrative rule. This is in statute that this location, like courthouses and schools, you cannot carry a weapon. And that way we take it out of the realm of a policy passed by a private organization, and we elevate it to something that's clearly understood to be in the law. So I take the point that Senator White and Senator Benning and others have been making about that there may be ways in which these rules could connect to existing statute. I think that's an important discussion for us to have. But just to be clear, what the bill tries to do is say it's important to let people know that it's against the law to carry in these areas, because as Senator Sears pointed out, there's not only the opiate epidemic as a flashpoint, the addictive power of opiates and people needing to have them, but there's also now the anti-masking thing, as well as, I would argue, the kind of radicalization of the open carry movement. So there's a lot of things at once that are converging on these buildings, and that's what the law is attempting to speak to, or the bill is attempting to speak to.
But I appreciate that. Are there other questions for Devin? Devin, thank you. And if you could just find out what the general.
Senator Sears, could I ask
yeah.
her one more question? So
can I just
Devin,
finish my comment?
Oh, I'm sorry.
If you could just find out the regarding all hospitals have signage and et cetera, and have they had any encounters with violations of that signage? Not necessarily, even tobacco. I'd be interested in how they then enforce that. If somebody walks into the, I saw a picture yesterday of somebody smoking a joint in the Capitol of the United States of America. I think that they took that selfie because they were so proud of themselves. I'm not sure I'm proud of them.
Senator Sears, I can say that many hospital policies require the healthcare worker to call security they go through a list of what you do, which is first to ask that person to secure the weapon in a locked place in their car and come back. And if they refuse to do that, then security is called. And if security doesn't work, then I could go back and check and see and what happens after that. But again,
if you could just check on the incidents as well as the policies of all the hospitals. Senator White has a question.
No, I'm fine, thanks.
Senator Benning has a comment or question.
Just a question. The Dartmouth incident, correct me if I'm wrong, did that involve a son who shot his terminally ill mother?
He shot, I don't know if the mother was terminally ill. She was in the ICU for, and I'm forgetting the word. I don't know if she was terminally ill. I believe she had like a blood clot and a brain aneurysm.
Okay.
That she was recovering from.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Karen Horn, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. Karen, welcome to Senate Judiciary. Happy New Year to you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Right. Happy New Year. This is my first time in your committee this year. Right. And thank you for asking our opinion on S30. We had a board meeting last week on Thursday, and the League of Cities and Towns board voted unanimously to support the intent of this legislation. Clearly, they are frontline with the general population, and they're frequently called on to make decisions that might anger somebody who the decision affects. So we find that it's very important to address this issue. So the board did have a few suggestions regarding language. The first being that we think it would be helpful to be very clear that we're talking about public government buildings, because there are other places in the statute where public buildings are defined. It might be an apartment complex, and you know, there's a lot of public buildings, but I think what's key here that you're trying to target is government buildings. They were a little bit concerned about the phrase essential government functions, that might encompass a really wide range of responsibilities that's difficult to define in statute. And if you're going to use that term, we feel like it does need to be defined, but maybe the more targeted way to approach the whole issue is to focus on public government buildings. And then the third recommendation that board members had was that you might actually look to the tobacco statutes. Your committee had a discussion last week about what about outside of buildings, and in the tobacco statutes, and I copied the language in my memo to you. It says that you can't smoke within 25 feet of state-owned buildings and offices, except if that 25-foot zone goes onto another person's property, you know, but that there's some standard there. So if we were asking people to secure weapons in their cars, for instance, that they would be able to do that in the parking lot, but they would not be able to bring them closer than 25 feet to the building. It's something for the committee to consider. And those are essentially finally, given recent events and actually not so recent events in some local jurisdictions around the country. So we've been fortunate to date in Vermont, but that's it. We've been fortunate. There's not another reason.
I've had kind of over the weekend, email conversation with the town manager of Manchester regarding the bill. And some of the things that he suggested and that I suggested in talking about it are similar to what you suggested, certainly making clear which public buildings, but maybe leaving it to the towns to decide. For example, is it necessary? Yes, the town hall, which is the office building for the town of Manchester, obviously, but what about the salt shed? Is it necessary there? You know, those types of decisions, leaving that up to the communities to determine which buildings, which government buildings.
Yeah, we had a conversation about that, letting municipalities establish the parameters for their community, but we do think, apologies to Senator White, we do think that in this instance, it's important to be clear and to have one standard that applies across the state to government buildings. So.
Well, that does mean that we need to better define essential government functions, which you suggested.
Yeah.
Senator White. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No,
Karen.
that's fine. Or to define the buildings. I mean, if you wanted to specifically.
You're breaking up.
Exclude salt sheds, but I don't know why you would need to carry a weapon into a salt shed.
I don't either.
But no, you could.
I'm more of the parking lot, etc. Those issues. I would point out that in Bennington, a town office building, I can park right next to the building. So a 25-foot perimeter wouldn't help me at all because I wouldn't be allowed to park in any of the locations right near the building.
That's what I was going to say too, is that there are many town halls where you park right beside it. And if you had a 25-foot perimeter, you couldn't even put it in your car.
Right. And if I go to the other side of the parking lot, I'm at the courthouse. Where you can't, so.
Yeah.
Right, right.
Anyway, just a thought. Senator White, did you have a comment or question?
No, that was my comment, was that the 25, specifying 25 feet is
Problematic.
And problematic. And I think that while it takes some burden off the town local select board to make those determinations, I'm always my goal is always to allow the local select boards to make their own decisions. And so, so Karen knows this, but, and I just, I guess I don't, and nothing.
Okay. Other questions for Karen? Senator Bennett.
Karen, I'm just going to respond. You made the statement, why would anybody need to carry in a salt shed? I'm going to try to red flag this every time I hear it. This is a constitutional right we're talking about. And when somebody starts the conversation by saying, why do you need to have that right at this location? To me, it turns the Constitution right on its head. I understand that there is a desire to protect people in certain places, and we're walking a very fine line trying to do that. Earlier, I don't know if you heard the testimony about 3705 being a remedy potentially for this problem. But it seems to me if everybody put a sign out front of their business and said no weapons here, eventually you get to the point where your constitutional right is literally useless. And I'll just caveat all this by saying, I don't carry a gun. I used to be able to say I don't have one until I had my father-in-law's ancient shotgun handed to us as a hereditary memory of him. But the long and the short of it is, this constitutional right shouldn't be having to be defended on the question of why do you need to exercise it here? I can understand many of your businesses may have a legitimate concern about why they should be able to say, we don't want this here for whatever reason. And I'm trying to walk through a fine line in my own head on how to approach this subject. But I really get nervous when a constitutional right has to be defended on the basis of why do you have to do it? Because that really sets us up on a slippery slope that I'm uncomfortable with. And I suspect your businesses really ought to have that conversation so that we can at least narrow down who really is in need of having some kind of protection, as opposed to us issuing a carte blanche government top-down statement that all businesses under a given category are simply prevented, because there are little nuances, like the earlier example of a child care center in Guildhall. There may be very good reasons why we don't want to incorporate them in this conversation. And I guess I'll leave it at that.
Well, Senator, your
go ahead, Karen.
comment is, your comment is well taken. That was careless of me, sorry. But we are talking about local government, not businesses, and the statutes have pretty significantly constrained the authority of local governments regarding all manner of issues relating to firearms. So we do think it would be very helpful for the legislature to state quite clearly where those firearms may not be carried in government buildings. I guess I'll leave it there, but
I just want to say I didn't want to put you on the defensive. That wasn't my intent. I'm actually hoping that in conversations about this as we go forward, you would go back to your businesses and ask that very question, because I think it's important for all of us.
We're not really talking about businesses, though.
Right, but at times, my personal, someone's personal rights, for example, to post their land and suggest that they don't want hunting on their land, going, is somebody else's right where they've always gone to that land. It's the personal property right. We've seen those battles over the years. And if store A doesn't want somebody to bring a firearm into their store, they have a right to say no. That's a personal property right, I guess.
I agree that they do, Dick.
They might come in conflict. Both constitutional rights could come into conflict. Just one with the argument.
Yeah, my neighbor just happened to post property that has been unposted for eons. I think he has that right. But if government was to say all property is posted,
right,
that's the conversation we're in right now.
No, I understand. But if 40 businesses in Bennington decided to post a sign saying no weapons, they have a right to do that. They're private businesses. Senator Baruth.
I just want to make it very clear, because whenever you present any bill regarding firearms, the number one argument against you is that it's the entering wedge, it's the nose under the tent, it's a slippery slope. And so I'm leery about having this conversation drift off into private businesses, et cetera, because ultimately it won't hurt the argument of those who oppose the bill. It will hurt the bill. The bill is very purposefully tailored around 3 locations, and the reasons for those I've repeated a number of times. So I wouldn't want to send our witnesses off to produce additional pieces of legislation or mission creep in terms of our conversation. As far as I'm concerned, S30 is only concerned with hospitals, government buildings, and childcare centers. So when we begin to have a discussion about private businesses, I feel as though we're just drifting from where the bill very clearly intends to go.
I think child care centers are private businesses, Philip, and that's a conversation we have to have.
Okay. Senator White, let's get back to the witness.
Yeah. No, I just was going to say, Karen, that if it's all government businesses, all government buildings of any sort, that does include the town garage and the salt shed and the and it does, and I don't think it just, I don't know in this case if government includes all municipalities. So if it would include the transfer stations, I don't know how government is defined here. So there are many municipalities that are not towns or schools that are private nonprofit fire stations that are a municipality, and water districts and transfer stations. So I don't know how far the definition goes here. I hadn't thought about that before.
Okay. Other questions for Karen? Thank you. Karen, thanks for being here. Well, I'm sure we'll see you again on some issue.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. The next witness is Kagan Mays Williams, counsel for every town for gun safety. I knew I'd screw something up in that title. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Sears.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And good morning. I am from Everytown for Gun Safety. My name is Keegan Mays Williams, and I serve as legislative counsel here. This is my second session working in Vermont. I had the privilege of testifying before the House Judiciary Committee, so I really do appreciate the opportunity at last session. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to be with you all here today in the Senate. Thank you so very much. I do want to thank Senate Baruth for introducing what we feel is a very important bill, and a bill that I think will offer common sense gun violence prevention protection for people in Vermont, people who are at their most vulnerable moments in hospitals, daycare centers, and public buildings. I agree that while right now I can define an essential government function, this wonderful conversation that we're having right now, it may not be clear to others what that government function means. I have my own ideas of what an essential government function is, but it would be great for the bill to be more clear about what that is. But what we do see is that this bill is responsive to the current rise and threat of armed extremism in this country today. Over the past year and over the past couple of days of this year, legislators all over the country, I'm hoping not present company included, have received multiple threats simply for doing their jobs. I believe between May and December 2020, there have been at least 85 instances of armed protests at state capitals involving guns. So I think a bill like this removes the likelihood that any death threats or threats of violence from afar will materialize into any actual violence where someone is able to legally access a building. I understand that there has been a lot of conversation during this meeting about the intention of the person holding the firearm. It is our view that carrying a firearm or being in possession of a firearm necessarily intimidates citizens and emboldens people who are presently possessing those guns for the purpose of intimidating others. And as we can see, as earlier this month, what can start as a peaceful protest can morph into an insurrection or escalate into a gunfight. I've listened to a number of the witnesses. The Commissioner of Buildings and General Services did make clear that her department is in charge of deciding whether or not there'll be firearms inside of the buildings. I'm sure the people of Vermont are so grateful that she has continued that prohibition. However, if there is another commissioner who decides differently, it would be great to have a law in the code that protects the state capitol and other buildings that are publicly leased in the future. I also noticed that the Department of Buildings and General Services does not exclude firearms from the grounds. There have been a lot of conversations about concerns about the perimeter and the ability to park. I think the ability to add a provision which requires locked storage of a gun in the vehicle could cure that concern, while also having the added benefit of ensuring that people who are entering a space where a government function is taking place are doing so without the ability to carry a weapon. I know that our view, or the way that we are thinking of this, is more in terms of defense of First Amendment rights. Peaceful protest is an essential form of an expression of and a pillar of American democracy, and the dangers that are inherent in carrying firearms at demonstrations are really clear. So I would argue that SB 30 could go even further to prohibit firearms at public locations, or at least I would include that into the definition as an essential government function. Vote counting facilities, that's also an essential government function that should not bear the intimidation of a firearm. Also during demonstrations on public property, I would argue that guns should be prohibited from that place as well. And I understand that may be an unpopular view, but given the current state, I think that it is necessary. I wanted to add a fourth type of person to this: bad person, good person, sick person. analogy that seems to have been presented. I want to introduce a fourth person who may otherwise be reasonable, who is incensed when protesting or advocating for a belief of which they hold very deeply and dearly. And so all I'm saying is that I would not want one constitutional right to overpower another. Let's take the possibility of lethal violence out of the equation. There have been other people who have said that safety is the true concern, that the ability to possess your firearm may necessarily make you feel more safe. It cannot be ignored that at times it's been shown that introducing guns into a high stress situation can only increase the threat of injury or possibility of death. So the last thing I'd say is that, if Vermont were to act on this bill, it would not be alone. Just last week in the Virginia House of Delegates, they passed 5 bills, which are now headed to the floor. And that legislation includes a ban on guns in the Capitol, in the Capitol Square, and guns at polling places in Washington State. There is legislation that's pending banning firearms from Capitol grounds and at public demonstrations. In Oregon, there's a hearing on legislation to prohibit guns in public buildings. And also in Michigan, there are 2 bills that would prohibit carry on Capitol premises. So Vermont would not be alone in really responding to this particular moment. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, and then I'll go to Senator Baruth. How do you respond to Mr. Davis's testimony? By removing the ability of good people to defend themselves, we remove the deterrence for bad people to do harm.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Sears. I know that there are, of course, no law can completely take away the ability for a person who would like to do harm to another to do harm. But we do have a wealth of laws on the books for the purpose of deterring people from committing certain actions. As I've listened here today, it appears as though the firearm prohibition in schools and in courts in Vermont has been terribly effective in preventing any type of harm. And it appears that SB 30, I've heard everyone say that there hasn't been any incidents yet, but given the current climate, I would hope that SB 30 could ensure that that there would not be a future event where someone was hurt.
Senator Baruth had a question. You're muted, Senator. It gives me great pleasure to finally say that to you, that you're muted, because it's usually me that's muted.
I did want to thank the witness for her testimony, and then to pick up on what Ms. Keegan Mays Williams said about the different pieces of legislation in motion around the country. Those are all areas that have seen real violence, attempted takeovers of their capitals, plots against their governors, almost science fiction like events. And that's what's moving them to act. I think some people would then say, well, we haven't seen exactly the same thing in Vermont, but the point, and I think this is missed sometimes by gun rights advocates, Vermont is inextricably linked with the rest of the country via the internet. And the way this radicalization spreads is via the internet. And, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Gun rights groups, like every other group, organize using the internet. And radical groups like the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, etc., the Proud Boys, they also use the internet as their main recruiting and information dissemination tool. So it's not an accident that we're seeing a radicalization in many open carry states. That's the place where it makes sense for people who have in their mind to destabilize government to do their organizing. That's one of the reasons why this bill comes forward in Vermont. So as the witness says, we've been fortunate thus far, but we are not immune from what's going on in terms of the national online radicalization. And, you know, I think if I point back to when we passed the ban on high capacity magazines, within a few days, there was a rally on the State House lawn where they gave away high capacity magazines for free. And that's not something that I would associate with traditional Vermont. That's a kind of radical posture that we will freely distribute high capacity weapons to individuals as a way of making a political point. And that happened in Vermont. And I found it very unsettling to have that happening on the State House lawn. So all a way of saying that I think we have been fortunate, but we need, like the rest of the country, and especially the other open carry states, to be rethinking exactly where we do and don't want weapons.
Well, I want to just comment on it. I've found many protests to be inappropriate over the years, but people have a right to those types of protests. You know, I found the protest on the inauguration of Peter Shellman's last term to be inappropriate, but that people had a right to do that. So I don't want to get into which was inappropriate, which wasn't. The question here really is, how do we deal with what is a very, how do we deal with this issue that you've raised, which is firearms in public buildings, or government buildings, excuse me, and hospitals and childcare centers. We've heard from a number of folks about that, and that's what this discussion is really about. I appreciate the discussion about what's going on nationally, but I'm more concerned with what's going on in Vermont and how Vermonters are dealing with it, and what's our best. What do we do with this bill, Senator White?
Well, I was just going to say, and I'm not, I have some concerns with this, but I also want to say that one of the things that's happening in Vermont, and I think I'm right in saying this, is that while there were calls for people to protest and all kinds of things on the inauguration day, that my understanding is that the 4 major gun groups in Vermont actually asked their members not to do it because of the fear of what might happen. And so I don't want to look at just what's happening nationally, but what's actually happening in Vermont. And I think that I'm right in saying that they did ask them. And I also wonder if there is a fear of radicalization, and it seems that, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I wonder if the more actions we take against the right to be armed, if that gives fodder for even more radicalization, because it gives more reason to, I don't know that for a fact, but I just wonder sometimes with kids, when you tell them not to do something, then they get angrier about it. And the more you tell them not to, the more fodder they have for doing it. So just a thought.
Okay, Senator Benning.
So first, I'd just like to respond to Senator Bruce that he was uncomfortable about that group that met to protest on the State House lawn on the 30 round mags. You described that as being anti-Vermont. I personally would counter that. Well, you made a reference to Vermont and that being, I can't remember your exact words. I just wanted to say, in my eyes, that's exactly what Vermont is all about. People have a right to protest in support of their constitutional rights. We're going to have more of this conversation, I should say, for all the folks, especially the witness now testifying. Senator Baruth and I have been on opposite sides of this equation, but we also go out to lunch every week when it's not COVID blocked. So we're not by any stretch that far into opposite camps that we don't have the ability to reach out and try to figure out what the other one is up to. But Ms. Kagan Mays Williams, you did say that with respect to this bill, you thought there should be some tightening up of the description. And I believe you were talking about public buildings and where things actually would be. I didn't know whether you had any language that you were going to propose as a result of that, but if you do, I'd like to see what that is.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Benning. I think I wanted more clarification as to what constituted an essential government function. I appreciate that in Vermont, for example, I'm not exactly sure where polling takes place, where the polling stations are. They may be at schools, they may be, obviously firearms are prohibited at schools at all times, but just to ensure that firearms are prohibited, for example, during the essential government function of conducting an election. So I just wanted to be clear, because I'm making assumptions of what I think to be an essential government function, committee meetings, committee votes, House floor votes. But happy to offer examples if that would be appreciated.
Yeah, I don't know how long you've been watching this testimony over the past couple of days, but the bottom line is we've been struggling with that question. And you're now talking about polling places, which are a municipal form of government. And I didn't know whether if you had some clear thoughts on what suggested language would be, whether it be municipal, state level, or even federal level for that matter. But if you did, I would love to see whatever that is. Thanks.
Sure, I'd be happy to offer.
Thank you. Senator Baruth.
Just a quick comment, and then I'll not beat a dead horse. But back to Senator Benning's comment about that demonstration where they handed out high-capacity magazines, being Vermont. Those high-capacity magazines were provided by an out-of-state interest that purchased them, transported them into the state, and then gave them out for free to Vermonters. That's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the radicalization of Vermont. It didn't come, that rally and those, the rally may have started by in-state interests, but those particular weapons or the magazines were provided by people from out of Vermont. And so the idea that Vermont is increasing one's arsenal, I don't go along with. I am all for traditional hunting and shooting. I'm all for people being able to have the weapons they choose to have, but we are naive if we don't believe that there are forces larger than Vermont that are in play in our state, both for and against bills like this. So I want to just clarify that what I was trying to say is that in terms of open carry states being flashpoints in government buildings, we are not immune from that. Fortunately, we've been spared it so far, but I said this before, when we've had public events in the State House where gun rights people have come in, I have myself had to walk the gauntlet from my committee room to my car, past hundreds of people dressed in hunting clothes who recognize me and act aggressively toward me in the State House. It's not a comfortable feeling. I am comforted by the thought that probably those people left their weapons in their car. I would be additionally comforted if it was illegal for them to bring them into the State House.
I would love to have this conversation. I miss our lunches, frankly, but when one of
Benning,
us,
may I suggest that you and Senator Baruth have a virtual lunch someday this week to settle
Happy to do it.
And
Happy to do it.
but may I further suggest that we come back to the witness, and if there are questions for the witness that we have, we thank her for being here. We are. I don't have any further questions. Does anybody have questions? Thank you so much for your testimony. We appreciate it. We are going to take this bill up again on Friday at 11:45, and let me explain why. That was the only time that we could schedule a physician to represent the Vermont Medical Society. So that's why we're doing it. At some point in the near future, I would like to hear, as I said earlier, devote 2 hours of committee testimony to Mr. Bradley's group and Mr. Davis's group, and 2 other groups that you have, Senator Baruth, maybe a half an hour each. They can choose their own witnesses. That will make it easier for Peggy to organize what would then be more of a public forum.
Mm-hmm.
You would let Peggy know which 2. And Karen, you had a question or comment?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to follow up on my comment about municipalities in particular being constrained. The statute at Title 24, Section 2291, Sub 8, allows municipalities to prohibit the use or discharge, but not possession of firearms within the municipality or specified portions thereof. That's the law that's on the book today. So I wanted to just point that out to you. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. And then another witness that we may have is Darren Goins from the National Rifle Association. So let me know, or Peggy know, and Eric, you're continuing to research other laws and their impact. But I think it's clear at least that if we go forward with the bill, we need to do a few amendments on a couple of places there, particularly on what is an essential government function, and there was a couple of other places where we really, it needs to be worked on.
Yeah, I've been taking notes as we went along, and I'm sure committee members also will have thoughts about language that needs reworking if we get to that point, but I've also got some record of that.
But I'm intrigued by 3705. I don't know why I want to make it 2705. Senator Baruth.
I'm wondering, and tell me either way, I'm fine either way. Would it help if I were to work with Eric, having listened to the committee discussion, to work on another draft that would come from me, or would you prefer that we all as a committee work on a next draft?
I'm happy to do that, have you do that, but I'm not sure there are 3 votes to move a bill out of committee without a lot of committee discussion. I hate to have you spend your time on that and Eric's time
okay.
on that.
All right, so
I think what we need to arrive at some consensus if we're going to have 3 votes to move the bill forward. I will be right on the table. I have concerns about the bill, but I also am trying to be open-minded to the fact that I think there are issues in hospitals, particularly that folks are facing. And I want to hear more testimony there. I think I'm having trouble with government buildings being so broad. We haven't really.
And
that's one that worries me. I didn't realize, I assumed we were talking about the town hall or the, municipal office building and the state house and surrounding campus, but it seems like it's really expanded to what is a municipal building.
And to clarify, I'm fine with clarifying those things, tightening it down, even whittling it to the buildings themselves. But I did want to make clear that I don't even at this point want to be targeting only 3 votes. I'm cognizant of the fact that Alice and Joe often vote against a bill like this, but I am definitely still open to trying to find a way that that not just a bare majority, but a strong majority of us could agree to go ahead.
Well, it would be nice to have a 5-0 vote. Senator White.
So when you're looking at the definition of government buildings or essential government functions, things like our state's attorney office is in another building. They rent a floor on another building that's a commercial building. So if it is, the entire building would be prohibited here. So I think we need to, there really is some fine tuning that needs to be done.
And it, just to put my cards on the table, if it turned out that the committee was only able to agree on, town halls and the campus of buildings that we deal with in Montpelier, then I would take that as the committee's will. So it may be that there are other decentralized offices that we can't cover because it becomes just too difficult. So, I'm fully open to narrowing this down to a core protection.
Thank you. I think what we're going to do now is adjourn. Been another great discussion. Tomorrow, we're going to have a joint hearing with the House Judiciary Committee on the RDAP report, and
So
at 10:45, we're going to.
Yep. So you'll get 2 different Zooms from me today, guys. One for the 9 to 10:30, and then the one for the joint hearing.
And I will let you know as you listen to the testimony on the RDAP report. I believe the House has agreed to go first on the legislation that goes with the report. But there are things that government operations would also need to look at in that report, Senator.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. We'll see you tomorrow, or probably see all of you at 1 o'clock.